on a Friday, I'd be at the office from 6 in the morning till 12, 2 in the afternoon, focusing on whatever the jobs report was or numbers or doing trades. And then 8 hours later, I was in a crack house in the Bronx.
That is today's guest, Chris Arnade. And to be clear, Chris was not at the crack house as a user. He was actually spending his free time outside of his job on Wall Street, documenting the lives of drug addicts, prostitutes, and others in the homeless community in New York City. He discusses these experiences and how they ultimately led him to leave his Wall Street career and eventually start traveling again, using walking as his primary mode of transportation. He now documents his experiences meeting people around the world on his popular Substack, Chris Arnade Walks the World, which we'll link up to. And whether he's walking in Uganda or Japan or the Faroe Islands or his home country in the USA, Chris uses walking as a way in to help him reveal and explore some of the lesser-known parts of the rich cultural tapestry of our planet, and of course to dive into some of the bigger issues and themes around a variety of topics, including things like healthcare, urban planning, the current state of broader cultural concepts like the quote-unquote American dream.
The American dream, effectively, to me, is a form of prosperity gospel, which is we've raised kind of the idea of success to almost religious idea that the meaning of life is to do well in your career and to make a lot of money and to be able to afford trips.
The commonalities of humanity.
As I've come to realize, both in my work in the U.S. and my work overseas, is that people need other people. People need to be part of a community. And so the kind of goal in the U.S. of being as unique as possible and celebrating the individual has left people in many senses feeling very empty and very lonely. But it's also allowed the creation of kind of a physical landscape that speaks to that.
And many more you'll hear in this conversation today. You also get Chris's best advice for exploring a destination on foot, how he connects with people from all walks of life everywhere in the world, and how you can too. 4 places he recommends for taking a long walk, including his number 1 favorite country to explore on foot and why, his favorite packing hack, and some golden counterintuitive travel advice on what neighborhoods to stay in and why, which you can apply to any city you visit, and why not to visit some of those top 10 places you find on many of those lists on the internet, and much more. It's all happening right now in this episode. So buckle up, strap in. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Happy New Year and welcome. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. Kicking off our 12th year on the podcast. So excited to have you here. We have so many incredible episodes coming your way, so be sure to follow or subscribe or whatever you do in whatever app you have that you're listening to this. And I'm excited to bring you this episode today. Chris is a fascinating guy. I mean, he has a PhD in particle physics. He built a successful career on Wall Street and then left it all behind to pursue a career in what he calls, quote, pop ethnography, which you'll hear about today. It's a wonderful conversation. I've been wanting to have Chris on for quite some time and so excited to bring this one to you. Don't forget, before we dive in, zerototravel.com/newsletter, our free weekly newsletter. It goes out once a week. Sign up if you want to keep in touch over there. Would love to welcome you into that community as well. And stick around on the back end after the conversation if you want to hear my 2 favorite takeaways from this chat. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Chris Arnade. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the other side, my friend. Cheers. Chris Arnade, welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for getting up so early and gracing us with your presence here. You know, man, I have to confess, I have spent way too much time prepping for this chat because your writing is very engaging. I must say, I keep getting sucked into all the articles. So I do want to encourage people, if they want to check you out, we'll link up to your Substack, walkingtheworld.substack.com, dispatches and photos from walks around the world. Yeah, man, welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk about all things walking. And, we talked about this beforehand. We're going to do a little Europe versus America type of thing, but I think that's just a light way into perhaps a more thoughtful conversation around some of the things that you cover. I'm just wondering a bit about your background because it always helps for context to understand kind of where you grew up and where you spend most of your time nowadays and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I have a bit of a strange background. I grew up in Central Florida, outside of Tampa. My dad was a professor of effectively anthropology, although he did political science. And so we traveled a lot as a child. I was actually born in Spain, lived in Nigeria. Traveling was always kind of what we did as a family, a large family, for often for a year at a time. And this was in the 60s and 70s when travel was not a big industry. But then I kind of settled down and got a PhD in particle physics actually. Um, and from that I went to finance where I worked on Wall Street for 20 years. And I did traveling then, but it was a very different type of travel than how I traveled as a child, and very different to how I travel now. It was kind of business travel, which I never really had experience in my life before. And then for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's a midlife crisis, maybe it's a crisis of faith. But I quit Wall Street in 2012, 12 years ago, and I started focusing on what I do now, which originally was focus on poverty and addiction in the United States. I did a book based on my 8 or 10 years driving and walking around the U.S. into neighborhoods that people generally live but don't visit. Um, Focusing on addiction and poverty and loneliness and meaninglessness in the U.S. And it took me 500,000 or miles around the U.S. In my car over the course of 6 years. So Hunts Point, Bronx was the biggest place, but then I did Portsmouth, Ohio, El Paso, Texas. You name it, I've been to that part of the U.S. After my book was published and COVID hit, I kind of sat around figuring out I was kind of wanting to do. I wanted to go back to see the world again, get out and see the rest of the world. Something I felt like I knew from my childhood, but I hadn't really done much of, not in a meaningful way. Not business travel to me at least isn't meaningful. And so I conceived this idea that I was just going to start walking around the world. I was going to focus on the big cities first. Jakarta was the first one I wanted to do, and the idea was, well, I was going to do what I do in the U.S. and the best way to learn, the best way I learned is simply walking and not taking cabs. I take buses now and then, but just walk across Jakarta. And so I conceived of this idea. I call it the Substack. Kind of evolved accidentally because it was just me taking these trips and doing these walks and writing my observations on them, and it became, walking the world is what I do now.
And so to clarify for people listening, because we actually have had guests on that have walked around the world. And when you say walking the world, you're talking about arriving at a destination and making walking your sort of primary means of exploration.
That's correct. I fast forward. I fly to a place, then I walk. I do have trips where I do longer walks, 300-mile walks, 250-mile walks. But yes, I fly to a place. I have two types of trips. I fly to, for instance, Jakarta, spend 3 weeks there in the Airbnb or hotel, and every day I walk 10 miles, 12 miles, but I return to the same hotel. Then I have another trip where I walk, let's say, across England from like Liverpool to Hull, where I carry my stuff on my back and I walk and I stay in a new place every other night or every night, depending on my pace.
Cool. So it's like, yeah, you're either base camping somewhere or you're kind of going one way. Just going back to your childhood a bit, what was the longest amount of time you spent in one place? Were you guys moving around that much? Like, were you always going to different schools? Were you homeschooled? How did that look?
We lived in Nigeria for a year and a half, so that was in Ife, if people know Nigeria. So it was, my kindergarten was me as the single white person in the kindergarten. But in general, it would be for a semester. My dad would work 3 semesters and take a semester and a summer off, so it'd be 6 months. We did India, Nepal, in 73, I believe, in that region. Then we did Eastern Europe. So my dad was German originally, a German Jew who had escaped. We had access to behind the Iron Curtain back in the early 70s, mid 70s. So Czechoslovakia, Hungary. So that was a bit of kind of, I would say like a 4 month trip, 5 month trip with kind of a week here, a week there, but 2 weeks there, depending on. My father traveled extraordinarily inexpensively. He stayed in, at other professors' homes, or we stayed in very, very cheap motels.
Do you have any siblings?
I'm one of seven, so
Wow.
we all went.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
I'm the youngest of seven, so we would all go. But people would age out. When they got kind of to high school years, they would say, I don't want to I want to finish high school, or I want to. So by the end of the trip, it was just me and my brother for the last two trips, and it was just me alone for my final trip with my parents.
Wow. I mean, how do you feel about that whole experience? Because, when I talk to people that have traveled so much as children, I always get it's a mixed bag. Like you never know how it is affecting that individual later in life in whatever ways. I'm not saying positive or negative. I'm just wondering for you, how has the experience impacted your life as an adult?
I mean, it completely changed, completely made me as who I am. I mean, I traveling was always, I just thought it was normal. I knew in high school that we were different because my father was the only professor in town. It was a white working class. It was a small working class town in the South. Um, we were the only people who had passports. Who I probably like my sixth grade or seventh grade class was the only person who'd been on a plane. This is the 70s, early 70s. So I knew I was different there, but then when I kind of got to college, I figured that all kind of, my dad was a prof, I figured that all kind of quote educated people did this. And I got to college and I realized I still had an odd background. And then when I did meet people who traveled, when I finally got to grad school or whatever and met people who traveled, I also realized how I traveled was very different. There were two other groups of people who I've met across who travel, like they were missionary kids and diplomat kids. There's a term, the third culture kids, who are generally, Obama was considered a third culture kid, somebody who had a kind of a childhood where he moved around a lot and was immersed in different cultures. And it tends to create a person who kind of watches a lot. Um, you never really feel, you never really feel like you have a culture that's yours, which is something I've written about before. But I look back and it was a great experience, and I enjoyed the trips. I don't remember not having a good time, but I also remember that my favorite summer was the one we didn't travel, and I got to finally play Little League. I just wanted to play Little League, man.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when I look at my favorite summer as a child, it was the one we stayed, one of the ones we stayed where I played Little League. So you know.
I mean, kids can crave that sort of normalcy, routine kind of thing. I mean, what right now being in the States, do you feel, I mean, does that feel like home, would you say? Or do you still feel like there's a disconnect between you and the culture?
Um, Yeah, one of the things I write about a lot is culture and what it means to, I think one of the things I've talked about is I'm a cultural essentialist in the sense that I think culture really, really matters. And in fact, I'll almost argue the point that I'll argue the point, and somewhat provocatively, but I do believe it, that effectively, if you're from a different culture, you're almost effectively a different species in many different ways. Like it really is, it's deeply, a Nigerian versus an American versus a Norwegian versus a Japanese versus a Mongolian. We, humans are very, very unique in the sense that of all animals, we're taught how to live. We're taught how to understand the world, and that's a 12-year process, a 13-year process. A rat in Montreal is not very different from a rat in Vietnam. You drop a rat somewhere, it's going to figure out how to live because it's kind of wired into it. The human, we're taught how to live, and so I call it cultural grooming. One of the things about being a third culture kid is you're culturally groomed in a very weird way, but I'm still American. Like, and how that comes out, and I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people have trouble trying to go native. I always say that you can't go native. It's in a crazy, crazy process to try to kind of, become become a local is you can't do it, and you shouldn't try to do it. I mean, you should try, but you should recognize that you're never going to fully accomplish it. And one of the ways that comes up is one of the most kind of revealing ways of understanding who you are, or what your culture values that you don't realize you value is disgust. Are you disgusted by something? So I remember once when I was in Vietnam, I was there for 5 weeks in Hanoi. Um, Absolutely wonderful place, one of my favorite places, and I just went to the bus station and I said, I'm just going to grab a bus and go. When they have these hack vans, you just go and you just vans that operate, as delivery package vehicles, but also as they also bring people. So I went up to a town near the Chinese border, Langsong. I kind of chose it randomly, um, and it happened to be the dog eating capital of Vietnam. I'm like, okay, I don't want to eat it. I don't want to eat dog. I have no interest in eating dog. I'm not that culturally aware. I'm not that open-minded. Like, no, that disgusts me. It was disgusting enough to me that, I left after like 2 days. As I was planning to stay in like 4 days. I'm like, this is gross. This disgusts me. And so the piece I kind of wrote about that was I'm American. I don't eat dog. That's just not. I can't come to accept that. It's a visceral body level kind of illness at the thought of it. And so I think in that sense I am very much an American. And when you become a traveler and you come from a place, you have to recognize the place you come from and what cultural baggage you carry with you. And cultural baggage sounds like a negative term, but I don't mind being disgusted with dogs, eating dogs. I'm okay with that. I'm okay.
I was interesting that you used the word disgust, and I was thinking, is there something that in the reverse, right? Like, were there things that after having traveled and coming back to my home country of the States that like I didn't think were disgusting before and then sort of became disgusting within my own culture? I'm wondering, or my home culture, I should say. I'm wondering for you, like, did that happen? Were there things coming back to the States or now being in the States where like, oh, this is actually, walking in these different places around the world, traveling throughout your childhood and everything. Did that reveal things you were disgusted about in American culture?
Um, it's less of, again, it's less of a visceral reaction. There are things that frustrate me. They might reach the disgust level every now and then, but I can move on from them. One of the things you live here, you have to learn how to move on, or you're just consumed with anger or consumed with there are things in the process of the last 4 years of travel, coupled with what I saw the 8 years before when I was driving around the United States. I have come to think that the U.S. is there's a bit of a self-loathing going on because I am an American, and there are things that I think had I come from a different place would disgust me, but now they simply they frustrate me to a level that sometimes reaches disgust. And that's not really a great place to be because this is your country, it's kind of like will you ever find a place where you're completely 100% comfortable? I'm not sure. I don't think that place exists. Especially if you're trying to do it by travel.
Of all the things you could focus on when you left Wall Street, I mean, you said that might have been a crisis of faith or something. What did you mean by that?
Given that I have a PhD in particle physics, and given that when I was on Wall Street, Wall Street's a very much about numbers. It's very much it's a very cold scientific process, believe it or not. It was a bit of an idea that my entire trajectory of life had been about um, trying to understand the world through numbers and through spreadsheets. Some people call it spreadsheet brain, and saying, hey, there's this other way I knew the world as a child, which is just talking to people, just going out and meeting people. And so you wake up one day, after 10 years, 15 years on Wall Street and, having a PhD, and you're like, I don't really deal with people. Like, I look at them, I analyze them as like data, but I don't really know them. And so there was a sense of I need to get back and meet people on their terms. being alive is being human, and in some senses, I'd kind of escaped from the human qualities of life, in a very comfortable way, mind you. But the people I dealt with were all, you know, it was people who I wanted to deal with or who were let in to deal with me. There wasn't kind of some of the organic randomness of life where you have to deal with people of all sorts. Over the 20 years, New York City, 20 years I lived there, when I had gotten there, it was still kind of a messy city where no matter how much money you had to deal with all sorts of people. And by the time I left, it was harder and harder to meet people who weren't like you. New York had been kind of cleansed in some ways. I'd always taken walks as a way to relieve stress, as a way to kind of just burn energy or what. So when I did get to New York in 1993, I had never been to New York City before. I didn't know what I was moving there. So my first day in New York, I took a subway token, and I went up to the end of the A train up at the Cloisters, at the top of Broadway, at the top of Manhattan Broadway, and I walked to my new home in Brooklyn Heights, which was a like 18-mile walk along Broadway, 16-mile walk. It took like 12 hours, 13 hours, but that's always how I understood how you knew a new city. You just walk it. You just go out and walk it. And so even when I was on Wall Street, even when I was in grad school, I walked every weekend just to kind of as a way to kind of get out and see things and learn and stay in touch with the world. But somewhere around the end of my Wall Street career, those walks started to become less about exercise, less about relieving stress, and more about kind of just meeting people and learning and seeing the world in a different way, and getting out of my comfort zone in some ways.
I haven't walked as nearly extensively as you have in cities around the world, but I will say that New York City, one of the best places to just walk, like to just take a long walk in New York. You can't go wrong. It's one of my favorite things to do.
I think of all the cities in the world I've walked, I probably walked New York the most because I lived there for 20 years. So,
your father having taken you, the whole family, and traveling around studying anthropology, which is essentially the study of humans, and combining that with travel. And it's kind of like exactly what you're doing right now, which is kind of interesting. In a way, I don't know if you would call yourself an anthropologist, but
I mean, I kind of call what I do pop ethnography. Ethnography is kind of field work. In some senses, it's pop ethnography, and it's when anthropologists do ethnography, they tend to spend 2 years in a place. So I kind of spend 2 weeks. Problem is, when you spend 2 years in a place, you get to know it extraordinarily well, but you only can do that so many places in a lifetime. 2 weeks allows you to kind of do a kind of big data approach to the world to see as much as you can.
Having left Wall Street and then diving into the type of work you're doing now, was it a challenge for you? Because you mentioned, sort of like, to use the term, the spreadsheet brain, like going from the spreadsheet brain to not just like, sort of saying, okay, I'm going to engage with humans, but actually building your career around that, or at least your creative pursuit around it. I guess it's turned into a career. I'm not quite sure how that evolved. You can talk about that if you want, but were you like intentionally wanting to push your comfort zone in that way to re-engage with sort of like meeting different types of people?
There was part of it that was intentional. There was part of it that was kind of organic. I just knew that I was kind of frustrated with what I was doing in my life, being on Wall Street. The value of Wall Street is, the perk is it provides you with a bit of money. So I had a flexibility that a lot of people don't have. I built up a kind of a savings that allowed me a little, to basically burn 2 years of saying, okay, well, let's just do this. Let's see what happens. I got a nice severance package. It's still pretty, in some senses, a reckless decision because you're walking away from a pretty steady stream of money.
Sure.
But
not small money either.
No, not small money. I've never really enjoyed luxury in life, and I think it's largely how I was raised. Sometimes I'll get invited to talks, and I'll tell the person booking me, it's like, please do not put me in a nice hotel. Like, I know, like, just put me in a cheap Motel 6 or a Super 8. Like don't try to book the like Ramada at the beach or whatever. I've never found myself enjoying comfortable places. There's something very uptight about them. They make me uncomfortable. Um, I prefer kind of places that have are on the bottom rung. And so I've always basically lived, even when I was making good money on Wall Street, I effectively lived like a grad student. I don't buy fancy stuff. I don't buy fancy clothes, fancy food, fancy anything. I never really understood the process of once you have a certain amount of money, why you need more. Like what are you trying to do? I don't need an expensive watch. I got to see part of my process on Wall Street was really learning about the culture of wealth, just how much people needed to feel satiated or fulfilled. There were people who were making 5 million a year, 3 million a year, who were felt like they needed that much money. They couldn't live on anything less. I needed like 30,000 a year, man. Everything else was gravy. Like
Yeah. Wow.
the money was never really an appeal. I mean, there's a certain amount of money it's great to have a safety net. It's great to build up a certain amount, and so you can have a flexibility. When I travel now, even though my Substack is doing quite well, I still travel about as cheaply as you can.
Going off of everything you just said, is part of that ethos, is that what attracted you to focusing on poverty and addiction? You were at a point where you're like, you could have creatively chosen to kind of focus on any subject matter, but you chose that. I'm just wondering why.
There was this really absurd period of about a year where the transition wasn't clean. I basically switched to photography and walking and writing about 3 years before I quit Wall Street. Most of my early work, was done in the Hunts Point, the Bronx, which is a neighborhood of about 80,000 people, of which 78,000 of them are below the poverty line. I ended up documenting, for lack of a better word, a group of maybe 40, 50 homeless addicts who lived under bridges, shot heroin. Half were half were prostitutes. The other half jacked stuff for money. I spent time with them for 3 to 4 years, basically 4 days a week, 3 days a week, and all my weekends were up there in the Bronx when I was still working in Wall Street. So there was this absurd period where on a Friday I'd be at the office from 6 in the morning till 12, 2 in the afternoon, focusing on whatever the jobs report was or numbers or doing trades. And then, you know, 8 hours later, I was in a crack house in the Bronx. And it just became this sense where it wasn't going to work. I couldn't pull off both of those. Partly because my bank was being one of their bankers writes about heroin addicts and prostitutes. They kind of get a little bit, PR department gets a little upset. And where was I happier? And I was happier doing the 8 at night in the crack house, not because it's where at a very selfish level I felt more fulfilled. I felt there was kind of there was more going on that kind of that was about the realities of life and the kind of inner in realities of the unreality of being on Wall Street. To put on my old mathematician or physicist hat, I'm immensely curious. That's always been the case, and how I satiate that curiosity has just changed. It used to be with numbers, now it's with people, and going out in the field and talking to people. And one of the things I learned about in physics is if you really want to understand problems, you really want to understand a problem, you have to push it to the boundary condition. You have to push it to the end, to the limit, and that's where kind of you really understand both the flaws and with a problem or the solutions or the flaws in the process are exposed. In some senses, looking at people at their very worst, or what we consider our very worst, I think you see a lot more clearly things that we kind of are hidden beneath the surface in kind of more successful society. There was a bit of that going on, a bit of kind of, well, if I want to understand America, this is the way to understand America, because this is where it's at its most kind of revealed. quite honestly, I got along with the people I was talking to. Just in case any viewers question it, I didn't use any heroin. I had two rules, which was never do any drugs and to always sleep in my own home at night. So I have always at some point went back and slept in my own bed, just to kind of, so I didn't go full, you know, shooting heroin myself. But I stayed and I stayed very much with certain. Otherwise, there really were no rules.
Yeah. I mean, it's so wild to think about a day you just described, like being on Wall Street, being in that environment, and then being in a crack house the same day. That night's almost surreal. How did you get the trust to become part of that community?
Time and honesty. I would go back to the neighborhood every weekend initially, and just walk around, just do what I do, walk around with my camera, take pictures. And I originally focused on what I consider the most positive aspects of that community, which were the pigeon keepers, the people who keep pigeons on their roofs. What I call kind of art forms that aren't necessarily understood to be art forms. One is pigeon keeping, men who keep pigeon on their. It's almost all men who keep pigeons on their roofs. People know Mike Tyson as the guy who keeps pigeons on their roof, but it's a very common hobby in kind of Puerto Rican neighborhoods, lower income Puerto Rican neighborhoods, and black neighborhoods. Also, people who fix up bicycles. They pimp out old Schwinn bicycles, so things that other people discard, they kind of turn into these bike clubs. So there was a focus on kind of the kind of the kind of organic art forms going on in these kind of communities, and so that was the original focus. But I was there so often, and I clearly stuck out. The neighborhood's 99.9% black and Hispanic. I'm neither. So, people would come up and start talking to me, including the women who were working the streets as prostitutes. And I just, over time formed a relationship with them where I was very honest about what I was doing. I would talk to them in a very open way. I didn't scold them. Didn't show any sign, of being scared of them or the drug dealers. I was just very kind of like, okay, this is what I'm doing. This is what you're doing. Let's talk. In terms of like quote a technique that got me the best buy-in from the community was, you know, I would take these portraits. I'm a photographer. I would take these portraits of some of these individuals. Then I'd print them out and bring them back to them. I'd frame them and bring them back portrait. And so I didn't think of that as a way to gate curry favor. It was just kind of what I thought was the right thing to do. It might seem odd to bring a portrait to somebody who's living under a bridge. They found it to be immensely meaningful. And there was one group, one particular woman who is central to my book, who she moved. When you're homeless, you have a home. You just move every 5 days or 6 days or 7 days or a month. She kept the portrait for at least 2 years, moving, even though she was living in a car, sometimes she was living under a bridge. So, that kind of brought me a lot of goodwill. And so they kind of knew me as a guy and then I started getting very involved in their lives in a way that ended up being very taxing emotionally to me. And so taking the rehab, visiting them in jail, driving them places I drove one particular individual across country to visit her mother, to bring her back to her mother. So I got very fully involved in a way that at some point I had to remove myself from because it got to be too much emotionally.
Wow. Was that hard to pull yourself out?
Yeah, I mean, I still keep in contact to the degree you can with somebody who's homeless. There was also a bit of a frustration, like, that like, all this effort wasn't really quote helping. And also the idea that they didn't necessarily want help. They weren't people who felt bad. They didn't feel like they needed help. Some of them are quite comfortable with their lives. This is who they are. This is what they know. This is when they wanted out. I would do my best to get them out. at some point it just got to be too much, where it just got to be, too immense of a problem, and you can't necessarily stop somebody from, or not necessarily you should stop somebody from doing something they want to do.
I'm curious about how you took what you learned being in these communities in the Bronx, and how you were able to kind of take some of that experience and use that to connect with people. Because in these types of trips, you're not living there, you're not coming back every weekend. You might be walking down the road, and then you meet somebody, and then you engage them in conversation. You have to connect with them and build a rapport in a way that they feel comfortable bearing a bit of their soul, perhaps telling you a bit about their life, allowing you to take a picture of them. No small feat.
Again, there's a big caveat here. I'm a relatively large white guy. The operative word is guy, which is not to be scared of people, not to be scared of a situation, not to be intimidated by a situation. Like, I never pretend to be something I'm not. When I was in the Bronx, I never tried to go like, "Hey, look, I'm just like you." No, I'm not just like you. I'm very different. And to be comfortable with who you are and be comfortable with that difference. Like, when they found out I have a little bit of money, they were always stunned how I dressed. Like, why aren't you spending money on, like, you wear shoes that you know a homeless person wouldn't wear. And I'm just like, that's just me. That's who I am. I don't care about those things. I care about books. I care about ideas. So there was always just the brutal honesty. I'm just different. This is who I am. I'm not trying to cosplay as a dealer. I'm not trying to cosplay as a user. Just be natural with who you are. If you're comfortable with who you are, people recognize that. They'll accept you. Like, don't try to pretend you're something you're not. I'm a big goofy kind of nerd. I'm very comfortable walking into what other people consider an awkward situation, because I understand that people want to like other people. That's how we're wired. There may be 2 or 3 minutes of awkwardness. You can get over that. Everybody's awkward, at some level. So um, I never really apologize about who I am, and if there's times where I'm clearly making people uncomfortable, I just self-eject. Like, if I'm not, if they clearly don't want me there, then don't try to force the issue. I trust 95, 96% of the people. One thing I tell young journalists is, a lot of people have asked me, based on my work in the U.S., and that work covered 8, 9, 10 years, for advice, and how do you talk to somebody? I said, look, the problem you're going to find when you go out and talk to Americans is you're too many people are going to want to talk to you. Like, you're going to have to shut them up. Like, and that's true. Like, people want to talk, especially people who don't really have a chance to tell other people their life stories, or people don't, unless it's, a police officer, or somebody who has kind of like bad intentions, or they think has bad intentions. If you just talk in a genuine way, you have to, you end up being the person who, there are times, when I go into a town or a community, just this recent trip I did, where the first night I'm in a hotel in Scranton, Pennsylvania. That's effectively a homeless shelter, as a lot of the lower end motels are. At 11:30 at night, I'm like, look, guys, I just got to go to sleep, man. Like, and this was a bunch of people who, you know, probably on the police's radar, probably are running from a few felonies here and there. People who, from a distance looked very intimidating, but they're buying me beers and passing me drinks. Like, it's just, you just have to act just like, I got to go to sleep, man. Like, I can't, because everybody wants to tell you their story. You have to put up with a little bit of discomfort. This is very different for males and females, okay? For the female listeners, but for men, in bad neighborhoods, 98% of the crime is about if you're buying drugs, or if you're cheating on a spouse, or you're cheating on someone. I don't buy drugs, and I'm not there to have relationships. So people don't have a reason to crime me. So
Yeah. Well, what did you discover on the recent journey, and compared to what you discovered some years ago when you spent the 3 weeks driving around talking about the American dream? I mean, this is for everybody listening. I mean, whether you're American or you're somebody from the outside that sees this, this idea of the American dream being pushed as there's this sort of perception of, at least there used to be, perhaps that's changed a lot. Well, you can come to America and you can make your dreams come true and all this sort of stuff. I don't know how you would define the sort of the perception of the American dream as it is right now and the reality of it, where those things intersect, if at all. Can you speak to that?
One of the things that's been fascinating about the last 4 years of travel across the world, outside of the U.S., is that foreigners also strongly believe in the American dream, or have a very strong concept of what the American dream is, and which is, almost every foreigner I talk to, and this is slightly different in Europe. It's certainly different around university campuses in Europe, but outside of university campuses around the world, people love America and they love the idea of the American dream, which to them is very simple, which is you can go to the United States, and if you have a good idea and work hard, you're going to be successful, and you're going to have a ranch house with a two-car garage, and air conditioning that you can turn down to 62 at night and not worry. Everybody in the family will have a car. You can drive to the mall, and you can buy luxury items, and life is going to be really good. And you're not going to have to worry about corruption, because if you have a good idea and you work hard, your kids are going to have a better life than you, and you're going to have great AC. So I think that's kind of the foreign concept of the American dream. And I think in some senses, if you're in Uganda, the American dream still exists. If a Ugandan comes to the United States, or if a Kenyan comes to the United States and does indeed work hard, relative to what they had in Nairobi or Kampala, they're going to find that they've realized the American dream, that they're going to get a lot of this material wealth, and they're going to have a relatively comfortable material life. The American dream, effectively, to me, is a form of prosperity gospel, which is we've raised kind of the idea of success to almost religious idea, that the meaning of life is to do well in your career, and to make a lot of money, and to be able to afford trips to Copenhagen, or Paris, or the Caribbean. Kind of live a life that somebody in Kampala would see as extraordinarily appealing, especially if you don't have AC. That to me is kind of the American dream. I think it's being realized in the U.S. still amongst, I'd say, immigrants. One of the reasons, my favorite towns in the United States generally are towns that are largely immigrant towns, mostly Mexican American. I love El Paso. El Paso is my favorite town in the U.S. I try to go there as often as I can. Los Angeles or South LA, I love as well, for that very reason, that, in some senses, the American dream is being realized, especially on a relative basis. The first generation, second generation is like the thing about El Paso is Mexican Americans can look across the fence, which is right there, that goes right through El Paso and cuts it off from Juarez, and they can look back to what they escaped, or what they, and say, oh look, my life is safer. I don't have to bribe officials to get what I want. You know, I have my ranch house on a half-acre plot of land. I have my F-450. So I think in some senses the problem is what 3 or 4 generations of Americans that start stalling a little bit, and the acclamation of material possessions starts losing its luster, and you're like, okay, now what's life about? Like, is it really about this kind of just accumulating as much stuff as possible at the expense of giving up community, at the expense of kind of giving up friendships, at the expense of kind of giving up beautiful things? We started this conversation talking about disgust. 9 years ago, when I was doing this kind of American Dream project, I didn't really notice America, or I noticed that physically it's an ugly country in terms of the built landscape. But it didn't really bother me much. It was like, okay, whatever. A strip mall, a strip mall plopped down on a plowed plot of land. It is what it is. It's functional. Like, it gets the job done. Every shop in it has good air conditioning. Every shop in it, is clean, has a working bathroom. So, again, something that somebody in Hanoi would, would find very appealing. But after a while, after having spent so much time in places like Europe, like France, like Germany, like even Mongolia, and other places where there's just kind of a more buildings that are a little more care to them, are a little bit more integrated into the community, a little more integrated into the landscape. Um, I just like it started irritating me. I'm like, this is really ugly. And there's no sense of place here. This strip mall here in the suburbs of Dallas could be in Chattanooga. It could be in Reisterstown, Maryland. It could be in Warwick, Rhode Island. It just looks it's the same. There's no integration into landscape. There's no attempt to build any form of community. It's very anti-community. It's very anti like it's very much built around um, every individual getting what he wants without having to interact and deal with each other in a social way. So there's this hyper individualism in the U.S. that sort of that that after being around the rest of the world, although I knew existed in the U.S., I knew that we're very proud of being a place where you can be you, no matter what that is. You can be the best you possibly want to be. You can be a you that's very, very different from anybody else, and you should be as different from anybody else. So you should celebrate you as an individual creature. Um, that's always been in many ways part of what the U.S. is about. But when you go to other places around the world and you realize that people need and want to have obligations to groups beyond just themselves, and that provides them a very important sense of place. I mean, Norway. I have not been to Norway in like 40 years, but Scandinavia is famous for being very communal in many ways. Like kind of being sticking out to be different for the sake of being different is not necessarily the goal of people. It's not necessarily the goal of people in most of the world. And there's a real and that as I write about a lot now, and as I've come to realize both in my work in the U.S. and my work overseas, is that people need other people. People need to be part of a community, and so the kind of goal in the U.S. of being as unique as possible and celebrating the individual has left people in many senses feeling very empty and very lonely. But it's also allowed the creation of kind of a physical landscape that speaks to that. Like the physical landscape, the built physical land, the natural physical landscape of the U.S. is absolutely gorgeous. The built physical landscape and man-made things are are very are very pedestrian fierce, but also very communal fierce. Like they're very much make it hard to build communities, to build connections, and both in their aesthetic, but also in their larger architecture.
The idea that let's call the the ugliness of some parts of it, right? You said not being attractive in many ways compared to European areas is sort of a physical manifestation of the individualistic sort of attitude that's promoted as part of the American dream.
People talk about walkable cities. I even wrote a piece where I have a metric that comes up with rating cities by walkability. I come up with like 7 different scores you can give, what makes a city walkable. One of my kind of like frustrations with that discussion is I don't think American consumers want a walkable city. So to test that, I went to Phoenix, which is famously one of the more unwalkable cities, and I tried to walk. And, you know, it was a dumb thing to do because nobody tries to walk in Phoenix. you know, um, it's not built to walk. The only other people walking in Phoenix or using the bus, as I tried to do, are people who can't have a car for legal, economic, or mental reasons. It's anybody who gets enough money to have a car, who can have a car, has a car in the U.S. and they want to drive. So, you know, I kind of understand what Phoenix is doing is that it's like this is quote what the consumer wants. They want their again their ranch house on a property that isn't nearly the size of a ranch. They want the F-150 or three F-150s. They want to get in their car and drive to the McDonald's or drive to the Starbucks or drive to the corner store. They don't want to walk. And so the city is not built like that. And so it was complete and abject failure. So it was so bad that I was supposed to go on to Philippines, and I'm like, I can't do this. I'm just done. I'm toast. And I self-ejected. I'm not sure that America, as we culturally currently are, wants walkable cities. There are plenty of people happy in Phoenix, happy with, when I wrote my piece that was very anti-Phoenix, it was found, it went kind of viral when it was found by Reddit, the Phoenix Reddit site. Boy, did they drag me over the coals.
Hey man, you got to be you.
But their point was basically, why are you trying to walk here? And that was kind of the fair, I kind of addressed that in the piece. I said, that was kind of the point of the piece in some senses, but,
In your defense, walking is a totally normal human thing to do. I mean, I love to walk, and I feel like you described, if you're walking in America, you're almost like the odd person out, because it's just like, why would you be walking if you could drive? But then I think back to growing up, and it was just like, it's just what you did. You got in your car to go get milk down at the 7-Eleven or whatever. You got in your car to go do this. You got in your car to do that. It's just what you did. Meanwhile, the 7-Eleven was only a mile away. And I remember going back once and just walking there, and I got to the major highway you have to cross. It's only about a mile. And there was like a no walking sign. Like you weren't like actually legally allowed to walk. I'm like, what do you mean? Like I have to have a car to drive across the bypass? This makes no sense. Of course, I just broke the law. But you know what I mean? It's just like so bizarre.
Oh, I mean, like, yeah, when I walk U.S. cities. I haven't completely ignored the U.S. in the last 4 years. I walked L.A., I walked Phoenix, I walked San Antonio, I walked Indianapolis, Orlando, Jacksonville, and believe me, like it's like I, people are like, "Why are you walking? Like, what do you like? You must be homeless, And that's the other people walking. So when I usually walk in someplace like Jacksonville, I do a 13-mile walk and then I take the bus back. I park, and same thing on the bus. Like, why are you taking the bus? Well, you're a loser, man. If you're on the bus, like, And the only other people on the bus are people who physically can't drive or legally can't drive or mentally can't drive, and me.
Yeah, and you. Well, I mean, if you're talking about lifestyle and walkability as a part of that, I mean, I know you had one piece called "The U.S. is better than Europe," which was, like you said, there was a caveat in the beginning, like this is like clickbaity intentionally. We're going to have a sort of a greater point here. I mean, you could speak to lifestyle and sort of overall happiness, comparing, let's say, like a Europe to America, and the sort of lifestyle that comes with what you're describing, the having to get into the car for everything, and all the sort of stuff you spoke to about the American dream, versus maybe how is there a European dream? Is that like, or is it the grass is always greener type of thing? I mean, these are big questions, and it's completely subjective, of course, in many ways, but I think along the way, you also have a lot of valid cultural points to consider. And for anybody listening also, these are things to consider when you're deciding where you're going to live. If you're going to set up shop somewhere, like I used to live in Boulder, Colorado, Chris, and the reason I moved there was because they had all the bike paths and you could walk and get around and things were compact. And I liked that idea of having that lifestyle. That being said, it's a bit of a bubble where, most people can't afford to live in a place like Boulder, Colorado, so there's all these considerations with lifestyle and where you live. I would just love your thoughts on all that.
I did four 5 long walks in Europe. If you consider England Europe, I did 5. I did two long. These are my kind of 250-mile walks, 300-mile walks. I walked across England. I walked from Liverpool to Hull, across the north part of England. I walked along the south coast of England from Dover to Portsmouth, or a little bit further. And then I walked the Rhine Valley in Germany. I walked from uh, uh, Dusseldorf to Bonn, Rhine and Rhone Valley, and then I walked across Netherlands, and I walked across Belgium, and then I walked the Rhone Valley in France. Now, the last one was a Rhone Valley. I tried to get from Marseille to Lyon, but I didn't make it for a variety of reasons. Injury was one of them. But so I effectively walked from uh, Avignon, almost to Lyon. And it was the last trip is where my piece is about being in France, where I was like, to the answer of the question, like, because one of the things I always do in the back of my mind is, where would I settle down if I had to settle down anywhere? Like,
Yeah, all travelers do that, I think,
yeah,
right?
and so going back to the early question of, like, I'm an American, so in general, I'm inclined to settle in America. Like, there's just I absolutely love NFL football. Like, it's just kind of one of the things I love. There's a certain part of America's culture that I just I vibe with. Um, but I think kind of the Rhone Valley in France is where I was like, okay, this is me. This is a place that has enough of the material success to have good air conditioning, or at least moderately good air conditioning, um, but also has community. And so I especially loved Valence. So when I was walking in France, well, generally when I walk everywhere, I get up at 6, go walk, 12 miles or 13 or 15, 16 miles, and usually stop for a break around 11 o'clock. And then I collapse at 3 in a cafe. Just sitting there watching in all these small towns, just watching the cafe culture and how people sit there communally, without their phone often, just organically developing relationships, and just how much stronger the community was. And I remember the first piece I wrote about France was like, okay, this is just, but it's really irritating me as an American. Like, what are you guys doing? Like, do something. like,
You're
what's
not
your
getting
job,
anything
man?
done. You're not being productive.
like like go out and do something, man. Build something. Like, and then by the second piece, I was like, okay, I get this. Like, this maybe not isn't me temperamentally, because I'm American temperamentally, but this is a better way to live. This is a healthier way to live, um, both in terms of how you approach food, how you approach your free time, how you approach relationships, how you approach everything. It's just healthier. It's more fulfilling in my mind. So I ended up writing a piece that Europe is healthier than the U.S., which got a lot of pushback or generated a lot of takes. But I mean, I generally believe that one, that Europe, and the way it parts of Europe, not all of Europe, but Europe and the way it approaches, certainly approaches kind of the balance between material success and community, has the right balance. The communal obligations versus the individual emancipation. It has a much healthier balance in my mind than the U.S. does, and I think you see it in the food and the way they approach food. Like in the U.S., the food is calories in, maximize the calories in the minimum amount of time. Now that's not true of everybody. There's a gastronomical scene in the US, but in general, the average person approaches food in a very unhealthy way relative to France or Germany even, where it's considered this kind of communal activity. And and there really is a farm to table mentality, um, and so that what you get is a lot healthier, both at a spiritual level, but also at a just a nutrition level.
Mm. Are you a spiritual guy?
I am religious. I'm Catholic, yes, and so I go to mass wherever I am. I attend religious services, both that if I'm in a Muslim country, I'll go to Muslim um, services, but at the same time, I also every Sunday go to Catholic mass if I can find a Catholic church. So
Yeah.
yes.
Can I get some travel advice from you? Because having taken these walks around and people listening that are attracted to making walking, it doesn't have to be the focus of their trip, but maybe like it's going to be part of their trip, or like they're going to go into a trip intentionally with like, some plans to find some places to do some walking, or perhaps even longer walks like you've done, like you mentioned, the Rhone Valley or across England and things like that. I would love to, yeah, I guess it's a twofold question. One is the sort of your best advice for perhaps some of the longer types of walks. I'm not sure if you're have certain resources, if you book everything in advance, if you just kind of wing it, if you have a tent with you. I don't really know how you do it, but would love to hear your best tips there. And then perhaps like 3 places that you would say like, hey, if you find yourself here, or if it's worth going your outer way to go here and like take a nice long walk.
Yeah, I mean, no place is better than walking than the UK. UK is the for the type of walking I do because I like to sleep in a bed every night, and so that means basically you need a certain amount of density. I like to be able to go 20 miles at most, so from hotel to hotel or bed and breakfast to bed and breakfast or whatever. In UK, because it also has a rite of passage law, which allows people to pass through fields, is absolutely the best place to walk. You can find any 2 points in England, and you can manage to walk between them with only a backpack on your pack, and a Visa card. There's a general website for walking that I use called Waymarked Trails. It's uh, it's an organization. It's hiking.waymarked trails, waymarked trails. Um, it's basically a map with all the hiking trails, hiking paths, and pedestrian paths out there, and biking and inline skating. If you do that, you can turn off the inline skating. Then there's an organization in England of people who rate trails, called Slow Ways. It's fantastic. You can have an app on your phone, and um, I generally wing it. I have a general plan, because I like people, and I'm kind of using the Woody Allen line. I'm two with nature. So I like nature. I respect it, but I also don't want to sleep in it at night. So I generally follow valleys, because that's where people cluster. And so I spend a lot of time looking at Google Maps, looking at waymark trails, kind of looking like, okay, you know where can I go where the longest between hotels I have is 20 miles or 25. I think one day I pulled a 28-mile day, but that was tough. And also, you don't have to be completist about this. You can take a bus, man. Like, like you don't have to walk every step. So um, the developed countries are easier to walk in just for a variety of reasons. So England, Germany, France, Japan. Japan's absolutely fantastic for walking, and I've written a piece saying Japan and England are very similar in that way. Those are my favorite countries for the long walks, and I spend a lot of time before a trip getting a general sense, but then I wing it once I do it. Um, the other thing is, I pack immensely light. I'm one of probably the lightest travelers there is. Um, I've gone around the world. I've done 3 months on the road with basically a school knapsack. I find the lighter you travel, just the more freeing it is. I always remind people that you can buy socks in every country. Like,
Yeah.
the other big hint I'll give people is Tide Pods. Carry Tide Pods. You can then do your wash wherever you want. I could give a seminar on packing light, but the MVP of packing light is hair ties. You can use them to like tie up everything. They're like rubber bands. So you roll your clothes up, tie them with a hair tie. It's the best. It keeps it tight. You can pack a lot into a backpack. when I was researching where to walk in France. So I looked at the valleys. I looked at Rhone Valley, and I'm like, okay, there's a basically a town every 15 miles. Okay. Then I use waymark trails to look at maps and say, okay, let me just see if I think I can get from here to here. Which route would I do? You have to drill down, look at the trail, and see, use Google Street Views to see, okay, is this really walking, or you could be next to an interstate, with semis going by you. If you find yourself and you're like, okay, there's 2 miles of all, like I'm not gonna walk along the side of an interstate for 2 miles. I will get a bus.
Yeah, right. Okay, so yeah, it's a bit of cross-checking between sort of Google Earth, Google Maps type thing with these websites you mentioned, which we'll link to. And those 4 countries sound like wonderful places to walk. I like the old school advice, Chris. It's like, just follow the valley. Very offline advice, right? Like, just get to the valley and follow it.
I mean, the Rhine Valley, the Rhone Valley, those are just, they're the densest places in Europe for reasons. Germany is a quietly great place. I absolutely love my walk in Germany. I walk from Dortmund. Sorry, I think Dortmund. I think it is to Dortmund to Bonn along the Rhine Valley. Through Essen, through a bunch of soccer towns. And it was just a wonderful place. It was both beautiful physically, and also very, very easy to walk, very pedestrian friendly.
For anybody listening that's interested in the idea of earning a living from their creativity, or like, this project with the Substack and everything, I mean, it's something you created, right? You're like, I'm going to walk these places, I'm going to document it, I'm going to share it. And then now you have, it sounds like, enough support where you're doing this full time. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Yeah. So to get to that point where you're going to do something like that, like write a newsletter, or what have you learned from running the Substack and kind of building it up? What would be your best advice to anybody listening?
I mean, you got to be really dedicated to it. I feel an immense sense of obligation to someone who pays for what I do, and so you can't be kind of like, oh, I'll give them a post every few weeks. No, you have to be dedicated to it. Um, and you have to really enjoy it because writing 52 blog posts a week, year with completely is if it starts feeling like it's a demand, then you shouldn't do it. I mean, if you're feeling like you have to do, oh, I got to write this piece, then you shouldn't be doing it, because you have to be dedicated to it. I think right now I got fortunate to be something of a first mover. I got onto Substack early. Um, I've noticed now in the last 6 months there's just a explosion of Substacks, and you know you got to have something. You have to have a different perspective. You have to have something kind of unique. You know, there's thousands of people who want to tell you about the food you should eat in France. Um, um, you got to find something kind of an angle or approach that kind of you're both is both you. Don't force something at the same time is different. Um, and then you just got to be very dedicated to it. And you got to do it because if generating content becomes your primary goal, then I think end up doing it wrong. There's a lot of stuff I don't write about, or there's pictures I don't take because it's like, no, what am I doing here? This is supposed to be an organic interaction. It's not supposed to this would make a great story. Let's go do that. No, you know, if it ends up making a great story, then that's fantastic. But don't force stuff, um, I feel really bad in some senses of there are times I feel bad where I hate taking pictures of food because it just feels very transactional. It's like I just want to eat my meal, man. I don't want to
I
drag out
hear
my
you.
camera. I don't want to drag out my camera and take a picture, get the lighting right so that readers say, "Look." But people love pictures of food, so I take pictures of food. But
You do it for them,
I,
Chris. You do it for them.
but there are times it's like I just want to hang out and have a beer, or not, not not turn it into a story. And I think in that sense, if you do it right, then your readers will trust you if you don't have a picture of your food. Like you can just simply say, like, I don't want to take out my camera, man, for the 15th time and take a picture of, my rice and beans. like,
Yeah, I
like,
mean, there's a reason
um,
why I do podcasts. I don't have to take pictures of food. So there you go. It's interesting to hear that, because actually that might be one of the big factors that makes your work, to me, really fresh, is that you're not going out for the story. You're letting it organically unfold. And then whatever you pull from that becomes the story, I suppose. It sounds like that's the methodology, which I think is a bit counterintuitive, a bit maybe not. Journalists tend to, you're interviewing people, you're kind of looking for the angles and I'm sure that's on some level, maybe you're thinking about that stuff sometimes, but it sounds like you're pretty good at detaching from that and the experience, which isn't something that everybody can do, because it becomes very integrated, because you're going to have to write something about Uganda when you come back from Uganda. So on some level, the conscious or subconscious is kind of working through what that's going to be. But if you're able to detach from that and just be present, that makes the end result, to me, better.
this is kind of now cliche advice, but honestly, look, I understand why people go. If you Google things to see in Kampala, which is not a very Google thing, but there will be a list of 8 things to do, or things to see in Paris, or things to see in Avignon. Um, you know, Avignon's a good example. I really like Avignon. It's a great city. I was just there. Um, I don't think I did any of the top 10 things you're supposed to do in Avignon. Again, if you're just at a content creation, they're already out. The content's already been created, man. Like if there's a Yelp list of the top 10 things to do in Avignon, I can guarantee you're not covering new ground. If you go to those top 10, but also it's just, there's a lot of things in Avignon. I'm always attracted. Avignon is divided into 2 sections. There's the historic town, and then south, I think it's south of the rail yards, there's a working class town, which is largely now Muslim immigrants and Congolese immigrants. I spent most of my time there. That just attracted me. It's like there are no top 10 sites in that section. What's there? There's a lot of people there, though. Like the bulk of the population lives there. So that's where I spent my time. Just because I was kind of, so in that sense, there was a kind of conscious decision. Oh, this is easier to create content that hasn't been created. But at the same time, that's where I wanted to be. It was just more. I'm just curious, like why, you know, what's here. So I think in some senses, mixing it up a little bit is helpful. I still don't understand why people take a picture of, I do understand, but I don't understand why people take a picture of, the Eiffel Tower. I mean, like, it's like we got a lot of pictures of the Eiffel Tower, man. Buy a postcard.
Last bit of advice I want to get from you, and then we'll let you get out of here. I mean, I really appreciate your time. Well, first of all, yeah, let everybody know where they can find all the stuff, and we'll link to this or anything you want to mention here.
Currently on Substack, it's called Chris Arnade Walks the World, and the only reason it's called Chris Arnade Walks the World is it was called Walking the World, but someone tried to apparently that I got a cease and desist by someone who has a patent on the word "walking the world." So so it's called Chris Arnade Walks the World. So
Yeah, that's the main thing. So yeah, people can check it out there, and we'll link to that. And then no, I was going to ask you for the traveler listening that wants to do what you just described. Like they want to go to the next time they go someplace, they're not going to do the top 10 list or do the normal things. They want to go to some neighborhood that is not any list or whatever, and just spend time there. It's kind of almost easier to just kind of go do the things because you want to see this and do that. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but if they want to have more of that style of travel, what's your best advice? Like, what do you do? Just show up and like sit at a cafe all day and start meeting people? Or, you get to some of these industrial neighborhoods, and if there's nothing to quote unquote do, what would you tell other people like that want to have that experience and make it like a way to connect more with the place?
I generally try to find a place to stay That's a mile away from the hot neighborhood, 2 miles away from the not. So if my neighborhood is really destitute of like restaurants and cafes or bars, then I can walk to the kind of hip neighborhood. I never try to stay in the hip neighborhood. That's step one. Like, I mean, and you can figure that out pretty quickly by just Googling and doing hotels. You see where they're all clustered, and like you probably don't want to be near the cluster, except in a few odd towns like Kampala or places that are really kind of destitute of things. Um, and then I just, when I get there, I just simply my first day, I literally walk across town. Most towns have kind of a circular look. I one day I walk across town in one direction, and then next day I walk across town 90 degrees separate from that. Um, so I get a lay of the land, and then over the course of my walks, I start finding out what I like and what I'm drawn to. Um, and by the end of it, if I'm in a town for 3 weeks, let's say I was in Jakarta for 3 weeks, um, by the end of my 3 weeks, I have a kind of standard walk that kind of it's kind of through a process of learning. I've kind of refined my walk to be the walk that I takes me to the neighborhoods I like the best and I'm most comfortable in. Um, and I usually have two or three. I become a regular, and I try to become a regular. And so you know, it may seem absurd in a place like Tokyo, which has, I don't know, like 50 Michelin star restaurants or something. But I eat in the same izakaya, like 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 5 nights a week, and it's not a particularly great place food wise. But and I completely found it randomly. I mean, I'm literally, you know, but I'm friends now with the owner. He like when I'm in Japan, he lets me store my stuff in the back of his restaurant when I go on these long, so he hugs me every time I come there. So it's just like, and I know some of the drama that going on of the regulars. Uh, I mean, I really just kind of choose a place almost by random, and I I like one that generally has good food. And so it's I don't just stick with the first place I find. If I don't like it, I try another one, and but by the end of my stay, I usually found one or two places I'm a regular in, and I just go back every night. I don't try to, you can eat at a different restaurant every night and certain places, but I don't see the point of that. I like to build a little bit of, so I know look, if somebody is going on trip and they get one trip a year, you should go see some of those top. You should see some of the top sites Yelp says you should see. Okay, like I'm not saying everybody should travel exactly like me. I get going. Like I've probably spent collectively over my life 8 months in Paris. I've never been to the Louvre. Like I now
You're like Mona Lisa. Don't need to see it.
But if I'm with somebody and they want to see the Louvre, I completely understand that, man. That's I get it. That I'm the weirdo here. Like there is a balance there, but you should probably see a few of the things you really want to see. But at the same time, just let yourself don't overschedule yourself. Just trying to kind of just wander and kind of walk and just organically develop places. And I personally think that's by the end of it, you'll know a place better.
Love it. Yeah, there is a great pleasure in becoming a local at an establishment, I think, anywhere. And I love that. I love that story because you're just like, well, the food isn't particularly good. I guess what, the connection you made more than makes up for the actual dining experience.
Yeah, I'm 100% ambiance guy.
Well, you got to feel it, I guess, right? Like you got the ambiance, you got the people. It's cool to kind of, have the inside scoop on what's going on in the place. And yeah, that's just, I think it's great, counterintuitive travel advice. Man, I appreciate your work. I appreciate your time. I'll continue to follow along, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Well, thank you. And I'm actually heading to your neck of the woods in a week. I'm heading to Faroe Islands of all places.
Nice. Well, maybe there'll be a part 2 at some point, and we'll get some more updates from around the world from you. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you again. Cheers.
There you have it. Thank you to Chris Arnade. Check out his Substack, Chris Arnade Walks the World. That's Arnade. And you can find it in the show notes. We'll link up to that so you can easily find it. Speaking of newsletters, we also have one, zerototravel.com/newsletter. If you haven't signed up for that, go ahead and join the community over there. Now, my two favorite takeaways from this conversation, then I'm going to leave you with a fantastic quote to start the new year. Chris spends longer stretches of time in a city, and he talked about being in more of those industrial neighborhoods on the outside of the hotspots. And I just think that, anytime you get a chance to kind of spend not just days, but weeks in a place, you're always going to be able to get a bit more under the skin. And if you have the opportunity to do that, I think that was a great reminder that he shared today. And that idea of kind of staying in those spots that are just outside of the hotspot, so you have access to kind of the things to do and the cafes and all that stuff, but you get more into like a neighborhood. And that can open up some different possibilities. And that story he shared about the restaurant he frequented because of the owner, even though he didn't really enjoy the food. We all have these opportunities to perhaps pass on a travel experience in order to prioritize a connection we might have with a local, which oftentimes ends up being more memorable. And, in this case, obviously Chris was passing on, having a good meal somewhere else to go see this person and this connection that he had and kind of to maintain that and keep it going. And this might mean for you or for me, skipping, say, for example, plans to go to a next city because you were invited to dinner at a local's house. And you already have a bus ticket, but you know what? Hey, here's your chance to go have dinner with a local. Take the $20 loss on the bus ticket and book another bus the next day. I'm using a hypothetical, but things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to mean blowing up your entire itinerary, but I think it was a great reminder for me that we have these opportunities to seize these types of moments, and I believe they can end up enhancing our travels. And just something I wanted to share with you before we head out. And I'll also share this quote, which I thought was a great way to kick off the new year, from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "Write it on your heart that every day is the best day in the year." Write it on your heart, he says. Wow, those are some powerful words. If I could do that every day this year, what an epic year it would be. So why not throw that out to close this one out? Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of this listening community, and I will see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by zerototravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.